Okay, very pleased to present Paul, who's living in Estonia now, and you can see the title of his presentation on the screen, so please.
Yeah. My name is Paul Beaudoin. I spent most of my life in the US, the last 30 or so years in Boston, and just after a long romantic relationship with Talon, I finally decided to marry this June, and so now I'm living here. I wanted to share with you a paper that is about how a particular composer has used mathematics to model a composition. And this paper actually comes about by a very strange circumstance. When I was getting my bachelor's degree in Florida, the conductor of our new music ensemble was teaching us how to play the Ligeti Chamber Concerto. And he mentioned one day this piece, this cello concerto, and very nonchalantly said, "Oh, that's a masterpiece." And I listened to it and I thought, no, it's not. So I spent probably the next 10 years looking at this piece, constantly trying to figure out what is it about this piece that makes it so amazing. About 10 years before Ligeti died, I met him at Harvard University. And I gave him my analysis, and he said, "Of course, I have no time for this." So it didn't matter to me. What mattered to me was that I had given him the paper and let the world move as it moves. So I will kind of come back to that. So I'm a teacher, and because I've had many teachers make comments that have changed the way I've thought about music in life, I'm very careful about what I say. This idea of a piece as a masterpiece has come up twice in my life. Once for this paper, and the second time for my PhD dissertation, which was on Beethoven. So I want to use Ligeti's own words, how he's thought about his music, especially in the 1960s, and how he has applied it to some pieces from this particular period. And it's actually a written paper, so I'll do that. So Grigori Ligeti recalled in his report on my own work that around 1950, he first began to imagine a static kind of music that rests within itself, with no development, no cliched rhythmic figures. These ideas were vague at first, and at the time, I had neither the courage nor the technique of composition necessary to transform them into works. It was not until 1957, when Ligeti fled his isolated native land of Hungary, that he had his first contact with contemporary Western music. Ligeti learned the latest developments in serial and electronic music composition. He absorbed this information very quickly, and his writings on serial music and musical form exemplified his understanding of these compositional principles. However, Ligeti did not feel compelled to use these techniques. For him, it seemed much more worthwhile to try and achieve a compositional design that discovered the process of change. In Ligeti's description of his own works, there are frequent visual and spatial analogies. In a 1967 article, he wrote that the instinctive translation of visual or other experiences into acoustic events is something that happens to me often. Almost always, I associate color, shape, and consistency with sound, and vice versa. Even abstract terms like quantities, relations, connections, and processes appear symbolized and have their place in my imaginary musical space. American music theorist Jonathan Berard has suggested that in Ligeti's view, the time of a composition evokes space, and that once that spatial analogy is suggested, it allows the composer to traverse the entire structure of music as if it were present at one time. Musical form, then, can be determined as an imaginary spatialization of the temporary process. Does that make sense? In other words, he thinks of music as a kind of picture. so that Ligeti can see this picture and then determine how the music flows within this picture. Ulrich Debelius, a very early kind of commentator on Ligeti's music, said that closely connected with this is the significance of several spatial planes with close and distant arrangements. So it's not just one picture, but it's several pictures at different distances and at different intersections. This gives stage-like views and formally important window effects that can open up vistas and just as quickly close them out again. Indeed, Ligeti has envisioned a radically different compositional path, one in which he would eventually come to describe with just a single word, and I think this word stayed with him his entire life, Überdeckungseffekte. It means overcovering effect. This is to put your music in a kind of shroud, to kind of hide the mechanics.
Or can it be masking as well?
Masking, yes. The idea of covering, masking to cover something. Yeah.
Masking.
Yeah. In a self-interview from 1971, Ligeti stated that the two categories, musical raw material and structural order, cannot be distinguished as separate areas. It is much truer to say that this linked network, or this structural order, corresponds to tendencies already detectable in the musical raw material itself. This sort of talks about your idea of constraints and then trying to find this wonder in the constraints. Ligeti refers to this linked network in his essay on About Lontano, where he writes that the formal principle was the coalescence of all the musical elements into a higher unifying complex. The higher unifying complex is a result of coordinated formal procedures and asserts that the individual musical elements are related to the entire composition in much the same way that atoms are related to molecules. So he goes from the micro to the macro. It is this higher unifying complex that becomes the governing principle that designs structural order in Ligeti's compositions. Another important aspect of Ligeti's compositional technique is his idea of aesthetic causality. Ligeti discusses this idea in an article, Zustande Ereignisse in Wandlung. It's terrible German, right? Motion in Ligeti's work begins when new elements or events, these are Zustande, functions as attacks on an existing musical texture or condition. These attacks then generate a reaction or some kind of transformation. To demonstrate this idea, Ligeti has described his work Apparitions as using two basic kinds of musical material: interweaving, as well as the nature of the individual lines they consist of. The second type of material consists of more solid groups and sound as a maze that appear inside the first type, these sort of interweaving lines, sort of like a counterpoint, followed by this kind of mass of sound that work together. All groups or single sounds appear or disappear suddenly, like sounding apparitions that leave traces in the music behind. These textures change after every attack of the sound groups and fragments. The scope of the change depends on the intensity of the attacks. The resulting musical form then grows out of the interaction between these conditions and these events. Then suddenly appearing events interrupt and cause changes in the conditions, and vice versa. These modified conditions have some effect on the overall musical shape. But because these events need to be new all the time and able to cause further transformation, it always creates a kind of modified condition. Thus, there's a continuous transformation in his music. In that same essay, Ligeti says that there are no established formal schemes anymore. Every individual work is forced, not least by historical constellation, to exhibit a unique overall form, but that the music needs to be appropriate only to itself. Remember that this is the middle of the 1960s. So this is a time of great sort of cultural and social disruption. And the hierarchy or the stronghold of the serialists of the 1950s is very, very much in question. And one of the people questioning these procedures, of course, is Ligeti. For Ligeti in the 1960s, the idea of formal components signaling that the music will go in a particular direction is out of the question. But this does not mean that formal functions are a thing of the past. Various kinds of structures in motion, different possible ways of deploying planes of sound, interweavings, contrasting and merging formations, dislocations or fusions, assemblages or decompositions, and so forth, all serve as functional elements in the form. It's only the unambiguous marker that points in one direction. There is no longer the idea of the chicken and egg. Every moment in the transformation both causes and effects what happens next. Again, relying on a visual analogy, Ligeti continues that the possibilities range from a single room, enormous, and to empty buildings, to winding subterranean labyrinths, or isolated homes spread over a wide area. The construction of the concert for violoncello and orchestra is one which Ligeti continues to seek out the relationship between musical raw material and structural order. These changes of densities and textures take place in very gradual transformations and hint at a hidden, though relatively simple model. Ligeti comments that the work is not a concerto in the traditional sense, as if the solo cello and the orchestra were separate entities opposing each other in some kind of romantic concerto. Rather, the whole texture of the music is constructed in a concerto-like manner. This concerto's relatively anarchic form may in part reflect Ligeti's association with people like Theodore Adorno and John Cage, whose own anti-concerto titled Concert for Piano and Orchestra may have served as a model for this particular composition. Adorno's writings, particularly those found in the Philosophy of Modern Music, were very familiar to Ligeti, and he frequently responded or referenced these in his own writings. Its form also speaks to the growing discontent of the utopian avant-garde of the 1950s. A negative engagement with tradition was beginning to surface, and the emerging disrespect for authority of any kind in the 1960s would explode in 1968 with political, social, and artistic uprisings around the world. This concerto was commissioned in 1966 by the Senderfreies Berlin and is dedicated to the virtuoso cellist Siegfried Palm. I cannot emphasize the value that musicians, performers had in the kind of conceptual avant-garde in the 1960s. People like Kathy Barbarian or Severino Gazzolini or Siegfried Palm. These were star performers really willing to push the boundaries of music. Ligeti's original plan was to construct a concerto in 27 more or less contrasting sections. However, during the process of composition, which lasted barely a month, the first section grew so long that it became a movement in its own right. As with many of Ligeti's works in the 1960s, it too is concerned with notions of near and far, or of creating the impression of huge spaces. The work's luminosity of sound is achieved through exquisitely calculated instrumentation and its successful realization of a musical conception. Kept hidden from the listener, though, are the terrifying demands it places on all the performers, such as successive instrumental entries on the verge of inaudibility, passage that court potential disaster as instruments reach their extreme registers, both as high as possible and in some cases as low as possible. The cello oftentimes plays 6 octaves above the double bass, notes which at the time were considered barely existent on the cello. The second movement of this concerto consists of the 26 remaining sections of the original idea. However, the boundaries between movement 1 and movement 2 are somewhat blurred, at least at the beginning of the movement. As Ligeti puts it, one notices a constantly changing motion as though you are in the same landscape, but like in a dream, where to keep churning out differently. Formally, you could think of this as a kind of set of variations, yet they are not variations, but a constant spinning out, like some kind of big development, where one doesn't know which musical ideas are actually being developed. With this spinning out, and using the window technique, seemingly foreign objects are inserted into the musical landscape. But subsequently, as the form evolves, these objects turn out not to be form and material, but actually critical to the success of the work. Again, it's this aesthetic causality that these things these attacks force change. But by the end, you no longer as a listener knows what a window was and what a window wasn't. And in Ligety's mind, there are also windows inside of windows. So this might be 1960s talk. What I want to explore here is the construction of this opening movement that appears as a very slow, restrained, and almost a kind of static musical unfolding. The piece begins with 7 measures of just the cello playing out of silence. And the work fades out into silence. But those moments of silence are 7 measures of notated rest. But Ligety urges the conductor to keep time, so that these rests is not a kind of grand pause, but a real measured sense of what has to happen. The beginning and the fading away of his music, writes Ulrich Debelius, seems to remain constantly conscious that it does not live unconditionally, but it must free itself from the silence, gaining its right to exist. And finally, with silence scored at the end of it, it must ebb away again into nothingness. The movement's 77 measures actually contain 70 measures of notated sound. These 70 measures are roughly divided into 4 equal sections. Each of these sections has a kind of unique sonic identity and specific structural purpose. I think it might be really helpful to listen to this piece. I will show, I think the audio will be fine. This is the WAV file, which is one representation of the piece. But I actually want to play the audio file itself. And what I'd like you to do is, as you listen to this, in your mind, what catches your attention? What are you hearing? What are the things that might make you say, oh, Again, we emerge out of silence. It does not get loud, so we will be okay. So, I think this is probably too loud. just to give some respect to the last 7 measures of silence, immediately there's an attacca of a chord cluster with some woodwinds. But here's where I started. I took Ligeti's idea of the picture plane and did a space-time graph. So in this case, pitch is done vertically, the lowest note at the bottom, the highest note at the top, and time is done vertically. Every 2 boxes indicates 1 measure. So this was the beginning of the uncovering. Because when you listen to this, what do you hear? What are some things that you remember? Anybody remember anything? No doubt, yeah, we don't remember anything. We teach. No doubt everybody can remember the very first pitch, E4, which seems to last this interminable amount of time. I had debated with myself about playing the premiere performance because the first performance of this is so frightening that you can tell these musicians are in a world they have no clue how to live. And the whole response that they have to this music is really, it's actually much better. It's much better than this very polished performance with Pierre Boulez. Anybody say anything that you remember? Because these are important.
There is unison E.
Okay, the unison E in the beginning. Yeah.
Yes, and the note, the pitch was E.
E, yeah. E above middle C, so it's E4. Yeah. And anything else that you remember? Sonic events, some orchestrational thing, some instrumental thing that you remember.
Some harmonics. I think.
Oh yeah, yes, this E is almost as if Chelsea had done it, right? You've got all kinds of harmonics and tremolandos and all kinds of things that color this E. When the harmonic moves from a string instrument to the wind instrument, there's a kind of pitch shift. This may have something to do with this kind of nearness and farness. But what about, yeah?
I remember extremely high register sounds.
Yes, really high register sounds here. In this last section, those things at the way top, that's the cello.
Yeah.
These things down here are the trombone and the contrabasses. And this is a very important marker for Ligeti. How about this 6-octave B flat that comes in the middle of the piece? Pretty striking, right? Like a Stanley Kubrick movie kind of thing. So, the piece. It's actually, in a lot of ways, very simple. So we start with E4, a single pitch and a single register for 17 measures. And its quarter equals 40. So these first 17 measures sharply define the first section. The unaccompanied solo player plays this pitch for the first 7.5 measures at a dynamic marked octuple pianissimo, so 8 Ps. Then a crescendo to a quintuple P. So he goes from 8 Ps to 5 Ps, and this is a crescendo. So, and then because he's crescendoed, that's a cause for a change. And what happens is the strings come in, the string section comes in on the same piece, on the same pitch. And then as we move along, you can hear some harmonics. There's a shift kind of in the tone color. That is also an attack. Those harmonics initiate the trill between E4 and F4 that announce the second section, right? So the second section, which is measures 18 through 36, introduces another pitch to the work, F4. And this is sustained for a while, about half of that, until a chromatic filling occurs, which you can see these 2 notes sort of form into a black block, right? The woodwind section enters, beginning in measure 27, and when the woodwinds enter, this is a cause, this is an attack, it causes the pitches to expand chromatically. And finally, in this section, we get all the notes between the D above middle C and the A above middle C. So sections 1 and 2, this first half, is only restricted to register 4. These are the notes that are in the middle C of the piano and also the kind of middle register of the orchestra. So where he begins is critical. Taken together, these 2 areas form what I'm going to call section A. Although we have 4 separate sections, these 4, yeah, you know this because you have Russian dolls. You know, the big doll, and you open up and there's a little doll, and you open a little doll, and a little doll, blah, blah, blah. So we have the big doll, and the big doll has 2 other dolls, and then those 2 dolls have 2 more dolls. Does that make sense? So I'm going from macro to little. Oh, let's see. Okay, so this unique signal of the 6-octave B flats initiates the 3rd section, and this is played by the orchestral strings. And what happens is that it divides the movement in half. But it does more than that, because if I'm thinking about E and the note B flat, what's the relationship between E and B flat? It's a tritone, and the tritone divides what?
Octave.
The octave. So it divides the octave exactly in half. So not only does he divide the pitch structure in half, but by moving to the tritone, he's dividing the movement in half. These long sustained B-flat octaves recall the opening, but because this pitch was absent in the first half, this moment is particularly marked for consciousness. And that's a word that I've come to really rely on, this idea of mark for consciousness. Somehow he's making you aware that something has happened. As this material expands in section 3, it also fills in the chromatic space between B flat and E flat, but it does so over 6 registers. So what happened in sections 1 and 2 is happening in a very quick, condensed, and truncated way in section 3. So what happened here is sort of smashed together and exploded here in section 3. This rapid expansion of pitch and timbre and musical space leads the work to its climactic moment. It occurs in measures 53 and 54 as a chromatic cluster played by the entire orchestra is broken off by a punctuating harp gesture. To me, the most spectacular movement, the most spectacular gesture in here is actually a harp glissando. Ligeti takes the note and you go D. By just moving the pedals, you can actually get the harp to make a glissando. It's, to me, amazing. As the pitch expands in this section, it also fills in the 4th. So as our E4 in the beginning kind of moves to A4 by the end of the 2nd section, B flat moves to E flat, also a 4th. So there's some kind of control here with the pitch material. But yet, whereas the unfolding of the 4th in the first half took 36 measures, it only takes 18, right? So we've got what happened in proportion. Hint, hint. This rapid expansion, blah, 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 got that? Okay. So with this huge, do you see in this 4 sections there's sort of 3 verticalities here? This is the harp punctuation. And what this harp punctuation does is it's like the rocket booster that sends the cello all the way up to the top. So you hear this by the harp, and the cello just decides, okay, I'm just gonna go up there, and that's what he does. And then the contrabasses, they're contrabasses, so they just sort of stay where they are, and then they just kind of go down. These extremities give us the sound for our last section. The soloist continues to push upwards, and the lower instruments balance the spatial boundary at its opposite end. These upper and lower boundaries create an immense open space in which Ligeti has described as the notes climb higher and higher to the 14th harmonic and beyond, I wanted to emphasize the height and to enhance the impression of empty spaces yawning below by having the double basses play on. These are the only 2 instruments left in the orchestra, the solo celloist and the contrabasses, so that an almost infinite space opens up between these 2 registers. My intention was to create the impression of a vast soap bubble that might burst at any moment. And when you have this image in your mind and you come back to listening to this, yes, it sounds, we've all done that soap bubble. Make it as big as we possibly can, and oh, darn, it popped, right? And this is the tension that he wants in this last section. Indeed, the soloist's ascent pushes higher and higher and higher until it vanishes. And the movement closes as the trombone drops off, the contrabass is sustained, G1, and then they just disappear into silence. So I think this space-time graph really kind of helps us understand, at least from a visual perspective, of how Ligeti's thinking. Jane Clendening, who was a student of Jonathan Bernard, did a dissertation on Ligeti's music in the 1960s. And she said that for Ligeti's way of handling pitch, the omission of tones in certain regions of his compositions that are prominent in others are an aspect of organizing pitch that creates a balance over the course of the entire composition without being tonal or atonal. And if you think about it, this piece is neither tonal nor atonal. It lives sort of on its own world. This principle is found not only in the concerto, but in other works like Lux Aeterna and Lontano. And also, all these works begin the same way, with a single pitch and a single register. In this case, the E4 asserts itself as a kind of spatial priority and a pitch priority, just as these B flats establish itself as a pitch priority and a spatial priority. But now comes sort of the math part. I did a calculation of how long each pitch was being sounded in the first section. And what I discovered was that E4 sounded 109 times. F4, the next pitch, sounded about half as much. All the other pitches are statistically lower, but particularly absent are B flat, B, C, and C sharp. These occur 0 times in the first half. And these are exactly the pitches that initiate sections 3 and 4. So again, this is one way of sort of balancing what Ligeti is doing in kind of pitch structure. Here's the second half of the piece, where you begin with the 6-octave B flats, 104 B flats. The next most pitch is B natural, 34. The pitch distribution is pretty standard. I'm sure you would find the right math word for it. But what it shows is that we are introducing E, F, F, and G, the first pitches that we heard in the first half, but they're significantly reduced in the second half.
How did you count? Because
Literally,
are you counting the appearance of a note? You're counting
yes,
how
if he
much
has a
it
whole
does?
note tied to another whole note, that's 2.
Okay.
So, and if it's tied to another one, that's 3.
So half measure.
So half measure is
half
the
measure was the
unit.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's not the initiation of the attack,
Mhm.
but it's duration over time.
Okay.
And so rather than say calculated time, I just calculated how many times does this note appear as a sustained note.
But just in the score, you said sounding, but it wasn't sustaining.
This is
sound.
orchestration, yes, yeah.
Mhm.
So yeah, just as a notated pitch, this is how I did these calculations, and I'm pretty sure this is exactly how he thought too, and I'll explain that a little bit later on. So the divisions of the concerto are designed to create a coherent structure, but the music seems at first very static. But inside this concerto are some significant orchestral landmarks that suggest there's another layer of interest. Previously mentioned, I talked about the soap bubble. There's the expansion of the cluster in the very first section. There's the punctuating harp chords. There's the very, very high note that comes in section 3. There's a lot of things that we hear. These musical landmarks follow, or actually I should say silently follow, an important principle of organization that's been with us since ancient times. We find this principle in Giotto and Cezanne, we find it in Hildegard von Bingen, and we find it, surprisingly not, in Bela Bartok. And in many artists who have recognized the powerful importance of the balancing proportion of the golden section. We find golden section in natural objects like nautilus shells and pineapples and sunflowers. But the golden section is a way of dividing a segment so that the smaller part is in the same proportion, I think, do I have to click? I might have to click one more time. Yeah, okay. So, B is to A as A is to the whole, right? And so there are different ways we can take a segment and divide it up into space. And this idea of the Nautilus show, which we see on the bottom left, yeah, this has been a huge organizational principle in visual art for a long time. Externally, the structure is not always apparent, but as H. Lee Huntley writes in his book, The Divine Proportion, it is important to bear in mind that the nature's surface beauty only conveys a mere hint of the loveliness hidden inside. Its mathematics is not its skin, it must be uncovered. In 1957, Ligeti felt the need to work out the construction of his music with great precision. When composing apparitions, Ligeti applied the idea of the golden section as a dominant formant principle in his work. In fact, he wrote, in the first movement of apparitions, I applied Bartók's golden section as was interpreted by Lendvai. And if you look at the volumes of Macrocosmos of Bartók, at the end of every piece, he actually gives a specific timing that gives an indication of how he's dealt with proportion in that particular work. And its first part is, why do I say this? We're talking about apparitions. In apparitions, the first part is low in register, and the second part is high in register. The relative duration of these two parts basically corresponds to the principles of the golden section. Subsequent shorter parts of the movement are also divided into the same proportion, so that the golden section is in fact the dominant formal principle of the entire work. Ligeti also disclosed that the formal characteristics of atmospheres operates on two levels, internal structure and audible form. The internal structure does not come through. You actually can't hear this internal structure. Both the overall form and the smaller formal elements are divided to conform to this golden section principle. I adhered to this proportion down to the smallest formal element. I gave the exact duration of each formal section in seconds, and then wrote on the first page of the score that both the duration and the metronome markings were simply indications. Significantly, I say Bartók because I know he's copying Bartók. Ligeti taught harmony in the same school as Bartók, in the same school as Lendvai, so there's this kind of body odor that they share. Similarly, Ligeti remarks that since Atmosphere, which is a work composed just before the concerto, he's never worked out these proportions with great precision. So this to me was a huge clue. So what I did next was I went through the score and I marked for myself these significant orchestral events and where did they occur. So for example, when did the orchestra come in? The first time when we hear as a melody. It seems so insignificant, but yet it is very significant. When did the harp glissando occur? When did the high notes come in? Where does the soap bubble appear? So what I discovered was that the concerto is composed in such a way that each significant musical event occurs at or near several positive and negative golden section notes. Indeed, many of these sonic events are not at exact points, but are very close to it. The next graph is, on Facebook I would write FTW for the win. This now is how he has taken the golden section and has mapped it onto his picture plane. Just like when we do visual analysis of paintings and we try to figure out where's the triangle in the painting, where's the center of focus, where's the vanishing point. So by taking the golden section not only of the entire piece, but both halves and each individual section, I marked where they occur. And lo and behold, exactly where those things occur are the important and significant musical landmarks that you hear. So although we hear sonically that the piece is very static, when we see it this way, we actually see that it's not static at all, but very, very active. Ligeti says that when you uncover this, he said that the work was composed in a concerto-like way, but never talked about this. In fact, I will tell you that no one has talked about this except me. And when you see this, you suddenly realize what he was kind of trying to strive for. Robert Lawler, who wrote a book on what they call sacred geometry, suggests that geometry is a way by which the essential creative mystery is rendered visible. The passage from the unmanifested pure formal idea to the here below, the world that spins out from the original divine stroke, can be mapped out by geometry. When the geometry of Ligeti's concert for violoncello and orchestra is rendered visible, the work does disclose itself as a masterful musical canvas that is engraved by the precision of an architect and the artistry of a sonic sculptor. And I hope I've kept my hour. So, yeah, thanks, that's it. Yeah.
Hey, questions, remarks, comments?
I'll go first.
And I think, you think that it is calculated by Ligeti? Or it is
Yeah.
intuitive?
Uh,
Emotional?
Remember,
It is emotional.
remember that I gave him my analysis, right? You know, of course, I won't have time to read this. Well, 4 months later, in my mailbox was a postcard from Ligeti. Dear Mr. Beaudoin, I wasn't doctor then. Thank you from all my heart for your analysis of the first movement of my cello concerto. I agree with everything you wrote. It is an excellent analysis. Yours sincerely, Gregory Ligeti.
Yeah, but he says, I agree.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Yeah. This is like okay in Estonian.
Okay, exactly.
We have one person
Why
who
not?
understands.
I think what he's saying is, yeah, you caught me. I agree. I did think this way.
Even, I think it's because I agree about the hermeneutics can be as well. I
Yes.
agree about the way you read it. It doesn't mean it is the way I compose it, but
I'll tell you why I take it as a kind of positive thing, in that it's
it
because
was positive because.
Oh, yeah, no, I
your,
won't.
your analysis is clever, so nothing against that.
the pieces just before this, he actually admitted to using golden section principles, so that it bleeds over into this work. What's interesting is shortly after this work, he begins to change the way he thinks about music. So we're looking at a window in Ligeti's life that will soon close, and something else will happen. So I'm sure that the influence of Bartók, the influence of his native land, I suspect that this is something that you bring with you when you expat someplace. And maybe this was one way of him sort of bringing his isolated Hungary kind of into the contemporary mainstream. But yeah, so I think it's actually intentional. I don't think it's by magic or intuition, and certainly not by emotion, because emotion and you can't get precision like this.
Can you, maybe you already said about it, but can you again point out where exactly are these significant moments that coincide with this golden section analysis? Because at first glance it seems that a lot of them are not so, I mean, on the graphical.
The graph is nicer to see it when it's close to you, but the points. What I did is I drew actually the arc. So that's why the graph looks really kind of complicated. But right where the golden section occurs, it occurs at a particular point in the score. So if I take these first 18 measures, and I find out where is the golden section, I find that it's actually in measure 7.5. Oh, I don't even know if I can see without my glasses. Which one do I use?
You use this.
Ah, the yellow one. Yeah, so if I draw the line for the golden section this way, it's going to occur in 7.5, so this is going to be maybe right around here. And right around here is, you know what, actually I should put the other graph. That's where the orchestra comes in. Maybe that's the better way to see it. So you kind of have to look at the angles of these lines. So in this first section, here, if I draw, this is the golden section for this moment. So right at that point is when the entrance of the orchestra comes in. If I do the same line backwards, that's where the cello rests for the first time. If I go to the sections, so here is section 1 and 2. And if I go backwards, there's section 1 and 2. And then I can do for the whole piece. This way. Or backwards. Oh, jeez. Where's the backwards one? Oh, yeah, here. Do, there, and that way. So, yeah, we have to uncover these lines for you. But
were there also other significant events that were not coinciding?
No. At the website for this conference, I've put a link of both the score and the recording. So you're welcome to download it and take a look. I made Universal very happy. Peters too, but that's okay. Score audio is very easy to find on YouTube. There's several performances of this now, including by college people. So what was once incredibly challenging in 1967 is now, we do this all the time in the university.
Maybe we can also put this question this way, that were there also musical events which were not, or which cannot be explained using these golden sections?
I think when you're talking about strings use of tremolo or harmonics,
well, yeah,
these kinds of
other
orchestrational
kinds of
decisions,
musical events which are not marked here because they do not overlap with this.
Yes,
Yeah.
there are, but I can't explain them by way of math.
Yes, and then perhaps the question, if we look at, let's say, a quantity of these events, are majority of events somehow articulated through these golden section way of explanations, or there are rather a majority of events which are not explained? You see, because this is actually the question of, what it actually does say, what it says. Because yes, I think it's quite clever and quite clear that at certain points there are some changes. And of course this is important information, but now the question is, are there also other musical events, and how many there are, which cannot be explained.
It's possible that they follow some order. I know that he often uses Fibonacci, but I haven't looked at the sort of micro orchestration.
I see. But let's say if we are looking at the events having relatively similar importance, I would say, not different. Yes, there are.
Maybe.
There are very many events, but anyway, if you are trying to locate these, perhaps you have to
I think
propose a kind of different levels. Which kind of events they are.
I'm thinking about the those people who flay. They take off your skin, and you can keep taking off skin, and I think this is still possible. I was happy to stop here.
Yes.
I'm sure there are more layers, And he actually said something to me once that has disturbed me ever since. And he said, the second movement is composed in exactly the same way. And I have been met with the devil every time. I have not yet figured that out. By the way, the only sketches that exist for this are a very small notation on a piece of music. It's actually a visual and verbal description. There's no music notes. So there's no sketches except for some verbal description of what's going to happen about these 26 sections. So,
Well, also my question was somehow inspired by the fact that, I mean, if we look at the form, so the symmetrical design is quite obvious.
yes.
But at the same time, if we look at this golden section things, then we see that actually, I mean, the form is quite independent from this golden section. I mean, if we are looking for formal sections, 4 or 2 sections, I mean, it's rather
Yes.
rigid symmetry here, rather than.
So one layer is the way the pitches move. Another
Yes.
layer is how these orchestral events happen.
Yes.
Is there another layer that suggests these micro?
Yeah,
Maybe.
so maybe, it can be also explained in terms of interaction of form, I mean, as sections, and then, let's say, musical events, which are, of course, they are related to the form, because actually the main boundaries is actually,
Very discrete.
I mean, they are based on changes as well, but changes which has more,
Can I comment to Kerry's question? Actually, Jan has a little the same. Maybe here is problem how we define this object, what we actually see in this. Because Jan asked why here are only some marks are missing. Missing, yes. And I answered that okay, it is maybe it is till 9 is possible to put so, but for bar it's bar numbers.
Yes, these little boxes with the numbers are the measure numbers.
Yes. And Jan also asked why this line is not directly.
Yeah.
And then I answered that okay, wall is built in this way, that maybe, and so we all see different things in the same object. It is often problem. Not problem, but it's nice.
Yeah, Gerhard, please.
How exactly the dynamics can be realized with the orchestra and the cellist?
You mean this octuple pianissimo?
Yeah.
This is a performer's problem. Don't forget also that he's coming from electronic music studios where octuple P can actually be measured by some numerical value. So we can have something barely audible and still be a number. But this is what makes his work kind of like a concerto. How do we perform this? 8 pianissimos. I mean, this is crazy.
Are there different performances?
Very German.
There's many performances, yes. Yes.
Interpretations as well.
Yeah, of course, every performance is an interpretation. I encourage you to hear the first one because it's the most vulnerable. As we have increased our proficiency at playing new music, our ability to perform this piece has made it less vulnerable. Does it make sense? It's like when you're a little kid trying to build something and you're kind of you're unstable, but as you grow older, you become more and more stable, and the next thing you know, you're building a real house. So,
Wow. Well,
It's okay?
Yeah.
All right.
I think it is. So, and of course there is this is always, if we are analyzing music, we usually try to show a kind of consistency and logic in it, but should there? And this of course comes from traditional formal aesthetics, that the aim of the analysis is to see consistency behind seemingly inconsistent appearance of, well, it depends of course, but
I often think
especially
of a
new
composer
music.
who's trying to find their own way. And what tools does this composer have? And most of the tools he had when he got to school. And so why wouldn't he have known Golden Section from Bartók and Lindbergh? And why wouldn't he apply it to his own works, especially as he's searching? Because we're taught in school these things are reliable, they're valid, they're aesthetic, so we use them. We don't try to teach our students bad voice leading. But they're very good at it. They're very good at bad voice leading.
Yeah.
So, anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gerhard, you have
Just
something?
quickly, does Ligeti also use the palindrome phenomena?
Not as discreetly. If you're interested in some other kind of mathematical principles, I would say look at his second string quartet. Second string quartet is like a dictionary of his mathematical ways of thinking about music. It's really brilliant. And it's also very musical. So, okay.
Okay.
Lunchtime, yeah?
No more questions, then thank you again.
Yeah, thank
So
you.
I think-
Yeah, now we have lunchtime, and please, we start at 3 o'clock.
Otherwise, I would go
Wait
like
for
this.
6 days, then you can meet again.
It's like the next.